Join us for a journey as we go back to the great civilizations of the past. Who were the people? What were they like? How did they begin and how did they end? Let's find out on this episode of Fan of History.
So if we stay in the Mediterranean, we talked about this, and we won't have to go off on a crazy tangent, but how about the Romans? The Romans didn't really have a coin like this as such.
No, they did not. The Romans were quite interesting. So the Italian peninsula had a lot of copper. And for a very long time, the Italian peoples used commodity money. So that means they traded lumps of bronze or lumps of copper back and forth, and they traded it by weight.
Okay.
So the Romans, for a very long time, until all the way into like the 4th century BC, they used these standardized weights of bronze as their coins. So first they were lumps of metal, then they standardized them in like proper weights, and they cast these massive coins. Then they would change these coins, these cast round coins that look more like a brick, to actual coins, but they were still cast. They were still very ugly compared to like the Greek coins. And all the way into like the 3rd century BC, like when the Greeks were already playing around with coins for like at least 250 years, then the Romans adopted coinage, and it was initially meant to trade with the Greeks in the south of the Italian peninsula. So the Romans are really late into adopting coinage. It's a bit of a curiosity. I'm pretty sure they traded with the Greeks for a long time before that, but the adoption of native Roman coins, it's quite late in history, so it's quite interesting.
Well, I hope then that's so very interesting, and I'm hoping on our next episode after this one, I'm going to have Dan comment on what he thinks about that, because we often say we're not really sure that we believe that the Roman Republic was founded 1 year before the Greek democracy, and this seems to be a plank in the platform against it being formed early. If they didn't, even if they were equal with the Greeks, but they didn't even come up with coins for 200 years, unless they were for some reason like the Spartans and they just were against them on principle, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean the whole idea of the Roman monarchy, when you think about the idea of coins as means of propaganda, I mean the Greeks. So as we entered the Hellenistic period, so when you see Alexander the Great, and after him all of the successor kingdoms, of course they used coins extensively as their way of making propaganda, of showing their faces on coins and putting their names and all of this. So the Romans were not that isolated. So did the Roman kings, why didn't the Roman kings adopt some sort of coinage? I don't know. It's a little bit of food for thought. Yeah. Like, how did they? So, just refresh my memory. When did the Roman Republic begin?
Well, they say it began in 509 BC, and then the Greek democracy was formed in 508 BC. So Dan always says it was they probably just made that date up so that they became 1 year earlier than the Greeks, because we know that they lost a lot of records when the Celts sacked the city.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are some questions about who was the first living person to be put on coins, on Greek coins. But I mean, in the 550s, in the 530s BC, the Persians were already putting regnal symbols on their coins. It wasn't necessarily the face of a specific king, but it was an image of a king. So the fact that the Romans didn't do it, it makes you wonder what was going on there. But yeah, it's a bit going on a tangent. But
no, it's important.
The numismatic evidence makes us ask a lot of questions because coins were very important for the Mediterranean peoples. It was very important for statecraft. So when you see the lack of evidence, the lack of numismatic evidence for a certain claim, it needs to be looked into because there might be some questions raised there.
Yeah. So do we know if the Etruscans have coins? Do we know?
They did. They did have their coins. They're actually kind of funny because they only struck one side of the coin. The other side was blank.
Oh, interesting.
And theirs was much more in line with the Greek tradition of coins. So that's interesting. They had the little, Gorgon face.
Okay.
And they had some other designs as well. So that's also interesting. The Etruscans, they might have been more numismatically advanced than the Romans, quote unquote. So once again, lots of space for speculation just by looking at the numismatic evidence.
Yeah, the numismatic evidence is, and I said it right, numismatic. The numismatic evidence is definitely important. Today we have genetic evidence and we use, literary evidence and archaeological evidence, but in artistic evidence. The numismatic evidence is sort of artistic, but that's a different part of it. Just the fact of them not having the coins, I think that definitely says something. What about the Phoenicians that were part of the empire? But how about the Carthaginians at this time? Did they have coins in 500-ish?
The Carthaginians in the 500s, they were actually very early adopters as well. I mean, the entire area. So yeah, like the entire area of the Levant was an early adopter of coinage as well, and a lot of it were copies of the Athenian coins. So, but the Phoenicians, they did adopt their own coinage, and this of course translated to Carthage. So you also have especially in the 4th century BC, you have Carthaginian coinage showing up, and once you start getting into the context of the Sicilian Wars and the Punic Wars, when Carthage really starts entering in conflict against the rest of the emerging Mediterranean powers, then Carthage starts striking lots of coins, and they had their own special monetary standard, which is also interesting because it's a whole separate field of numismatics.
Wow. I wonder, too, because I think they weren't really, the Greeks and the Carthaginians weren't necessarily getting along real well at this point in history, now that I remember. So maybe they didn't adopt coins because they weren't really trading as much with the Greeks. They were trading with their other trading partners and they didn't need them, maybe.
Actually, depends, of course, on the area where the Carthaginians were, what they were doing. But for example, if we look at Sicily was probably the main area of conflict between the Carthaginians and the Greeks. You actually have lots of similarities between the coins, so you have this idea of like total war between these two peoples. But when you look at the coins, you see lots of coins of Syracuse with designs very similar to some Carthaginian designs, and the other way around. You have some Carthaginian coins which, for example, have the face of Heracles on the obverse. Well, it's actually Melkart.
Sure, right. That's their version. Heracles.
But it's there. It's very similar to their coin. They just put a Carthaginian twist to it, because on the other side you have like the typical horse with the palm branch and some inscriptions in Punic rather than Greek. And the Greeks did the same. In their own coins, you have some of them which they show Persephone, but Persephone was also like a reinterpretation of the Carthaginian Tanit.
Okay.
So you have a very similar coin. It's just that instead of having Punic inscriptions, you have from the Syracusans. So it's interesting that despite these two worlds clashing with each other, there was either some commerce going on there, or there was a lot of mercenaries who would just fight for the highest bidder. But the coins communicated while the peoples went to war. It's really interesting to see these areas where two different peoples fight. And this is not just the case for the Carthaginians and the Greeks. You see a whole bunch of other examples throughout history, and you see an overlap between their monetary standards. Like, for example, the Romans and the Germanic tribes. The Germans, their coins were copies, like at least for the imperial period, they were either copies of Roman coins or they just transacted with Roman coins that they got through trade. So it was this hard border where no Roman could pass and no German could pass. No, there was commerce. People were crossing the borders and they were making commerce, and there were coins going back and forth and copies being made. It's really interesting how coins, how money unites people more than separate them.
I was thinking the whole time, it's like, and I remember, even like in the Middle Ages with the Crusades, like, they were so against, Islam and Christianity are mortal enemies, but they'll trade a coin with either one of those gods on it. Money is a whole different story.
The Crusaders, when they took Jerusalem and these big cities, before they made their coins in their European standard, they just started making copies of the Islamic coins, to a point that this fact got to the ears of the Pope, and the Pope sent them a message like, you guys better change the design of these coins back to a Christian symbol or a Christian motif, or I'm going to excommunicate every single one of you. What are you guys doing? Issuing Islamic coins in the middle of a crusade? You make some Christian coins. And they changed it.
Wow, that's interesting. And you must. Do you have any YouTube? Do you have any shows on that on your channel? If you do, I'll link them.
I don't. I mean, I've shown a few Crusader coins here and there. It's not my main focus of collecting, and it's something you need to study separately. But yeah, this time of the Crusades, it's another very interesting time period when two different worlds collided once against the other, and there was numismatic exchange and influences between one and the other. It's really interesting.
Yeah, so this happened way back in 500s and then 300 BC, and it continued on for 1,000 years, the same type of thing.
Basically, yes.
So, all right, we got around most of the Mediterranean. So now if we go to the empire in Persia did have a coin, right? There's a little different. There was a gold coin.
Yes. So Persia, so the Persians in the 530s BC, if I'm not mistaken, they took the kingdom of Lydia and they took the city of Sardis, where it was the main mint of the Lydians, and they found those nice little coins. So what they did at first was to just keep striking the Cresids, the coins made by Croesus in gold and silver.
Okay.
And then they came up with their own design and they adapted the coins to their own monetary standard. That's when the daric and the siglos were invented. And these were basically adaptations of the original coins of Croesus. It's just that now they had a design with the Persian king just holding, like, it holds lots of weapons like spears and shields and bows and arrows. But yeah, it was an adaptation of the coins of the Lydians, and it looks like from hoard evidences that most of the coins made by the Persians were used. They were found like in this western area, right where they bordered the Greeks.
Okay.
So they were mostly used to make commerce with the Greeks, because the Greeks absolutely love the idea of coins. So then, once again, the siglos, this silver coin made by the Persians, it became very popular in Greece. You find these coins, for example, with all kinds of little marks on them, little test cuts, little marks, and it's very likely these marks were made as these coins entered Greek cities, the Greek sphere of influence, and they were checked to see if they were genuine, to check them to be validated, to be used in the Greek sphere. And so there's another example of a huge influx of silver coming from this other civilization towards the Greek sphere, even though in principle they were at war with each other.
Right. That's really interesting. The Persian coins, it's so funny how the difference of the different cultures, the East and West, like the Persian coins, like the Syrians would have had coins like that, with their more very militaristic, with their, their king looking as a powerful figure. And I imagine if the Syrians had coins, they probably have pictures of dead heads and people getting their heads cut off and everything, because it's a coin is a way of propaganda. So the propaganda of the Persians was to show the strength of the king, and the propaganda of the Athenians was to show the beauty of their democracy in a way. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. Each city they adapted their message to whatever they wanted, the message they wanted to come across at that point. So, for example, the Corinthians had so at a moment they had like their Pegasus and Athena with a helmet. So you would put a certain god that represented a certain aspect of the human condition in a coin to communicate something. So why would you put Athena? Not only because your city is supposed to be a cultural hotspot, but also because Athena was the goddess of defensive wars. So it wasn't just that Athens was supposed to be the city of knowledge and philosophy and everything, but it was also probably the idea of we are this linchpin, this bastion of Greek culture, and Athens is here to defend it. The Syracusans were very famous for doing this as well. Like even down to their small bronze coins, you would see, for example, inscriptions of not only Zeus, but they would put in their legends Zeus Eleutherios. Eleutherios, for example, is the freedom giver.
Okay.
So the idea was, it's not only that we are Greek and we worship Zeus, is that we worship Zeus and Zeus is helping us to preserve the freedom of the Greek way of life. There were some very complex messages given, and the Persians did the same. The Persians, they put their king with spears, with bows, with everything, because that was the idea. Persia was a big empire. Its king, he was God on earth. He was unquestionable.
Yeah, warrior.
So there's the message of might, of power, and it's very clear. And every single, like, there were no designs made because that's a pretty design. They really paid attention to what they were going to put on coins, because making coins was expensive.
Okay. So freaking fascinating. All right, so if we're moving over, so you said that most of the Persian coins were found in the West, and at this time, the Persian Empire is pretty big. It goes way out to the east. We've even, theorized like how much influence did it have to the Far East and China and such. And at this time, now the Buddha is probably dead, but it's possible that one of the Buddha's disciples, or I believe, may have lived in a city in the Persian Empire. And my good friend Gil from History in the Bible podcast, he's actually writing a book on this era called the Axial Age. And it's saying how, this Persian Empire, once you got into the Persian Empire, so, if you were a trader or something and all the way in that city, I think it was Taxila, but way in India, you could end up all the way trading something, even if it was passed hand to hand, you could trade all the way to Greece and Macedon. So, but were there not a lot of derricks found all the way out east?
I mean, there were Greek coins found all the way there in Taxila. For example, it's interesting that you mentioned Taxila because it's probably the area where Indian coinage began.
Okay.
So they had like an entire different way of doing coins. Like they did these little bars and these little squares of metal that they stamped with like separate little stamps rather than one massive design. And it looks like their monetary system was based on the Persian system.
Okay.
So despite all of this big eastern extension of the empire not being very monetized, there were definitely trade routes going back and forth, because Greek coins were found all the way there on India, and Indian coins were also these like little bars. They get found in these areas western of the Indian continent. So there was trade going on there. There was definitely influences happening. So it was a region that wasn't very monetized as in the internal region itself, but there were trade routes. There were enormous, super long trade routes, and Greek coins found their way over there.
But not as necessarily as many of the Persian ones. And the Persian ones were kind of a high denomination too, right?
Yes, it's interesting how the silver coins were more concentrated in the West, and the gold ones, which were worth, if I recall, 10 of the silver ones, they first, they're not very commonly found in commercial context. They're more like, apparently they're more like a sign of imperial largesse. So it might be the case that these were given by the King of Kings to their satraps as a show of largesse. And maybe in these areas where there wasn't a highly functioning monetary standard, these were maybe melted down and used in normal barter. We don't know exactly what was happening there, but there was an economic dynamic. But slowly, as you get into like the late classical period and the Hellenistic period, you start seeing monetization creeping eastwards. And then when you get to like the Hellenistic period and all of this, you have pretty much coins being made and monetary standards everywhere.
Then everybody just knows. It's funny, sometimes when you read things like in the Bible or different things, when they'll talk about money, you could tell that they were written, in a money time. Because people just, today we're just used to money. We don't think of that we don't have money. And the same thing with them. And you'll find these things in the Bible, where they gave them money. Well, they didn't have money in 1200 BC.
Yeah.
So, that's interesting there. And so then, and I know we don't all know a lot about it, but so if we're moving over into that area, and we said that the Buddha may have been, in the same area. And also, it wasn't just them, Confucius and his people could have been very close. And even, in the time, and all these East-West connections are there. But in China at this time, and I know we don't know a lot about it. We didn't really have the same kind of money as in other Chinese history versus Western history. No. It's completely different. And in China, they basically cast their, right? And at this time, they didn't really have proper coins per se. And they weren't made out of like base metal, right? They didn't use precious metal.
Yeah, China decided we don't know why, but they decided to just go in this different direction altogether. They first used this, most monetary systems, they get born as a commodity money system. So they had they also worked with base metals, which they would use to make tools. And then tools started being used as money, as in knives and spades and things like that they would use to, I don't know, like to plant
right.
rice.
So useful too. It's actually more useful than a hunk of metal. Like you can't do anything with a hunk of metal.
Exactly. And then they started exchanging these tools as money. Eventually, they started making coins which were shaped as the tools, but they were too small to be used as tools. And eventually, they became the round little coins that we know of. They actually, for quite a few instances, there was like a multi-denominational monetary system. So you had round coins. You also had little spades, little knives. They were all circulating. They had different values. It's a very unique monetary system, and it used an entirely different system technique. So most Chinese coins were cast rather than struck, because they had to be made in such enormous numbers, because each individual coin had so little intrinsic value to it. So you have minting figures in the tens of billions every single year. Like when they find some tomb or some cache of some rich Chinese aristocrats, when they find some tomb, it's tons upon tons of coins. If you just Google cache of, like, I don't know, like Chinese coins found in China, ancient Chinese coins, you will see these walls of coins, tons upon tons of coins. So it was a completely different way of seeing money, but it worked.
Yeah.
It worked.
I'll tell you what, that's pretty interesting. There must be a reasonable to buy. I mean, from doing this podcast, I've actually become quite interested in this period of ancient China. So maybe I'll be able to buy myself a little China knife or spade money. It's not gold. Maybe they're available.
They are. It's probably one of the fastest growing parts of numismatics right now.
Yeah, and the Chinese population in general is up and, becoming having more money and disposable income, and interested in their history, so I can imagine. China, and I know like from doing the study at this time, and I read the Spring and Autumn Annals a lot, which is, dry ancient writers. But when they talk about their meetings between the states, it's a whole thing. But the states of China, they would trade a lot of silks and things like that. And they had a special rituals that, if you came from a lower state and went to a higher state, you might have to bring, and I'm just making up a number, 7 things of silk and this many of that. So they're and I don't really hear much about exchanges of any kind of coinage. And then later, I was reading the Spring and Autumn Annals of Wu and Yue, and that was written later, but they keep talking about giving 100 pieces of gold to people, like to a poor person. That would make you rich, I guess. But that didn't talk about a coin, just pieces. So,
oh yeah, there was definitely an economy of goods, of like precious metals and other objects working parallel to the coins. And one of the first, because probably the each individual coin had so little value, and so they also had this quote unquote barter system for these important gifts or for these kinds of transactions. And if you think about this, that's one of the reasons, for example, where currency, paper bills were invented in China, because you had these massive, whenever you had to do like a big transaction, you had to buy a house or something, you would have these enormous quantities of coins that would have to move from one place to the other. Instead of doing this, you would have a bill that was issued by the state. There were banks, there were treasuries, there were temples where coins were kept, and you had the bills going back and forth, and this would help move these important sums of money.
It's actually a more advanced way to do it when you think about it. The Chinese a lot of times do things a little more advanced, or it's a little different.
Yeah, and the first bills, like the first Chinese bills, are just fascinating, because the majority of the space occupied by the bill is a massive warning that if the authorities find out you're making a counterfeit bill, you're going to be put to death.
Yeah.
All of your property is going to be given to the offended party. Your entire family for X generations is going to suffer. They go like, we're going to do this and this and this and this and this. Oh, and by the way, this bill is worth X coins.
I could so believe it. It was probably, and how they're going to put you to death. They're basically going to chop you in half. I'm surprised they weren't going to kill your whole family, so that's pretty nice of them. Usually they kill your whole family.
They're going to make coins. They're going to make coins with your bones. I don't know.
That's very Assyrian of them. Oh, that is amazing. We're definitely not going to get into it, and because we've done it a long time. And I am trying to do the whole world. We know there was no coins, as far as we know, in the Americas at this time, and they traded with commodities, as far as we know. There was civilization. We're finding cities in the Amazon and in Mexico and in Belize and from 600 to 500 BC, but we haven't found any evidence of a coin monetary system, as far as I know.
Yeah, there was trade, because we see that the societies there were much more complex than we thought before, but it might have been in a different format that we still don't know. If they had a different form of government, you either had these like highly centralized empires, so they might not have had so much of a need for money, because it was a much more centralized economy, so they would just use barter. Or these were like these highly fragmented small communities, so that's another situation where maybe money is not really necessary and you can't really enforce a standard. So they would just trade whatever they needed for whatever they needed. Yeah.
And so wrapping it up, I had to say, like, as you're going through it, we moved from west to east, and how some places had money and some didn't, and it's really, so 508 BC is the birth of democracy, and it's almost like, it seems like an overused word today, but it's like there's the democratization of coinage came along with democracy. where more people needed these coins. Like if you were just either a mercenary or a rich trader or a government in the satrap, in Persia, then there's not too many of you. But now that we have these democracies and these citizens that are a part of everything, then I guess they needed a way to pay them, and it just sort of exploded from there too.
Exactly, and in the case of Athens, it's this interesting. The introduction of the Athenian owl is maybe one of the things that marks this transition to democracy, because the very first owl coins, they are attributed to around that time, like the very end of the Archaic period and the transition to this democracy. So we don't know if the transition happened and then the coins were introduced, but the fact that when you look at an Athenian coin, you have the little letters alpha, theta, epsilon, which stand for Athenaion, from the Athenians rather than from king whatever, from whoever issued it. That's a big sign of this transition, transition from a certain political system to another one.
Yeah, I could see it go both ways. I could see Pisistratus. Would be surprised if Pisistratus didn't release coins, but I would be surprised if Pisistratus released coins without him on it in some way.
Yeah, there were coins issued previously during this time, but they are. So there's a whole lot of theories as how they did it. Some people claim that different clans, different families.
Oh, I could believe that.
Issued their own designs, and it's just that they all adhere to a certain standard of weight, but they made their own designs, because you have like this big variety of designs right before the introduction of the owl, this centralized owl design. But yeah, the introduction of this owl is definitely connected to the change in regime, and this happens with a whole lot of other societies. Like, for example, when Philip II unifies and starts unifying Greece into his kingdom of Macedon, he adopts the Athenian weight standard. So then he knows, like, okay, this is the most important, because the Macedonians were a little bit they were considered sort of like barbarians. Right. So one of the reasons for him to legitimize himself with the Greeks is like, okay, I'm going to use a Greek standard of coins. I'm going to issue coins in a nice Hellenistic way, and I'm going to adhere to their weight standards. And then when Alexander took over, he refined this process. He unified the entire Greek sphere into this Attic standard from Athens, and their successors continued this. So there's a lot of connection also between the types of coins, the monetary systems, with the shifts in political status quo, basically.
Wow. I'm sorry. I guess I'm like a listener here. I'm just sitting here. Just listening and enjoying it.
It's fascinating.
It is.
There's
it is so
much. The coins are so important for the ancient world.
It's all part of the coins. Like I said, the coins, the artistic tradition, the written traditions, the archaeology. The material goods and the DNA, and it's another part, and it's so important. I think. I can't say why in this episode because it's too close to our next episodes and our next decade, but you're going to see also that there's a lot of democracies that actually start forming around there now for certain reasons, and these people are all, now all these coins are coming out, and it does have people need them. There's more people involved in the world economy than there was before because it's democratized in a way, and coins shows how that's happened. It's sort of like a chicken and egg. The coins... The democracy creates the coins, but the coins help create the democracy because it gives people more mobility, upward mobility, that kind of thing, actual mobility.
Yeah, exactly. The coin ends up becoming sort of more like a symptom of societal change.
Yes, so yes, it's a little bit of both. It sort of accelerates it. It's a symptom of the change, and then that actual symptom brings on more change.
Exactly.
That's safe to say.
As regime change, coins change as well to fit the new reality.
Yeah, so maybe because we could talk all day, we'll end it at that. What did I say? The change, this period, coins, and I felt that ever since we did the coins back in the 600s, coins have been changing the world because of the fact of the coin. But at the same time, because of those changes, coins are becoming more in use and further changing. It's sort of a circular system. And I think that's where we are at 500 BC. And if I was Dan Carlin, it would go boom. That would be the end of the... He has that great, when he ends, he goes boom. And that's it. It's over. Maybe I'll come up with something.
And then coins were a thing.
So yeah, let's end it at that. I'm going to, of course, all the links will be in the show notes for Leo's podcast. I will put the main link, but I'm going to pick a couple episodes that I liked and put them in there. I found his his YouTube channel to be like one of those you could really go down the rabbit hole, like, oh, I'm studying about this for this episode, so that's all I'm working on tonight. I'm not going to get myself, watching crazy videos, but I'm like, well, this is really interesting, and eventually I'm going to be in the 200s, so let me just keep going. Because you're you guys listen to him talk now for an hour, and you're very well-spoken, very knowledgeable on the topic. So the channels are, a podcast just doesn't do the justice of him showing you these coins are amazing. Someday, if I have a lot of money, I'll have maybe more than just some Chinese, metal knives. But I think it's great. And you have a collection yourself, too, so that's amazing. I'm so glad to have you on.
I do, and getting into ancient coins is actually surprisingly affordable.
That's right.
You don't need to buy a gold coin of an Egyptian queen. You can go with some lowly bronze Greek or Roman coins, and you have a perfectly genuine, perfectly old, perfectly awesome piece of history there. And people of modest means can assemble really nice collections.
Amazing.
So I invite people to head over to the channel. I have a playlist made for beginners with stuff like how to find the coins, how to avoid overpaying, all of that, these basic baby steps, and people can get started. And I really recommend people give this hobby a try because it's just wonderful.
Absolutely. And you're the one who said it. I listened, like I said 10 times, I re-listened to my episode, and you were the one who said it. It was just like, you could be holding this coin, especially the ones with the marks on them, because I don't know if we mentioned it in this episode, but the marks mean that's how you check to see if they were pure. That means that, and it's a whole thing, but that means that coin was all these different places in the ancient world, and it passed from a hand of, a mercenary to a trader to a king, whoever. You have no idea. You actually holding this piece of history that's not very expensive. And so, yeah, check out his link there. But I think it's safe for me to say I will also link our good friend Dean's website, because he actually sells ancient coins, and Fan of History gets no bonus for doing it, so just help our friends out. And if you're interested in a coin, check out with these guys, because I know we could trust them. And if you do want to buy a coin, as instead of joining our Patreon or sending to buy me a coffee, you could buy Dan or I an ancient coin on one of these websites. If you do, just let me know, and I'll send you my address, and you could mail me one of these ancient coins, preferably for me. But Dan's a nice guy too, so if you want to buy Dan a Roman coin, that'll be fine. Someday I'm going to buy Dan a Roman coin, and maybe Dan will buy me a fancy coin too. So anyway, I'll stop talking. I really appreciate you coming on and doing the show with us today. If there's anything else you want to add, let me know, and we appreciate it.
No, thank you very much for having me here, and I'm looking forward for the next episode.
Oh, me too. Thank you. Cheers.
All right. See you in the next one.